Welcome to your first set of online notes. Today we're going to talk about evolution. The major mechanism of evolution is natural selection, sometimes called survival of the fittest, other times called differential reproductive success. Over the course of many generations, those who are better adapted to their environment, or the most fit, will survive and produce more offspring. As they produce these offspring, their genes, the ones that allow them to be better adapted to their environment, will be passed on to the next generation. Over many generations, more of the individuals will soon have these beneficial genes, while those who had genes that were either detrimental or had no benefit will die off and their genes will be removed from the population. This happens in responses to any changes in the environment, both physical and biological as well, those interactions that occur amongst multiple species. Whether or not evolution can take place depends entirely upon the size of the gene pool within a population. The gene pool is the total of all genes and alleles found within a population at any given time. You can talk about the gene pool of the population, for example, of the humans of the city of Dallas, or the gene pool of the entirety of the species of cheetah in the world. This also helps describe the genetic variation present in a population. You go from large amounts of genetic variation, as you see in the human population amongst our 7 billion plus individuals, or the smaller genetic variety that you see amongst populations of endangered species, such as cheetahs, who have very low genetic diversity, and therefore a smaller gene pool. Three major types of natural selection that we will be discussing: stabilizing selection, directional, and disruptive. We will discuss examples of each in the following slides. For the sake of making things easy to understand, let's assume that we are going to be talking about height in a population of humans for the next three examples. On the slide, we're looking at the height of all the humans in a population graphed. Now, the average trait would be the average height of all of the people in this population. If the population were to undergo stabilizing selection, the average phenotype would be the fittest in that environment. For example, if it were of benefit to be of average height in a population of humans, let's say that was more attractive to the opposite gender, then those would be the ones who would reproduce, and those would be the individuals who would pass on their genes. This affects the extremes of the phenotype. For example, in our particular example here, the shortest and the tallest individuals would not breed, would not reproduce, and would not pass on their genes. The effect of stabilizing selection is to maintain a stable gene pool. It also decreases genetic diversity and tends to reduce the chances that any sort of new adaptations or evolution will take place. If, on the other hand, we were looking at an example of directional selection, we would see a shift towards one extreme or another of a phenotype. In our example of human height in a population, this would be if, for example, we had individuals choosing to only reproduce or find attractive taller members of the population. This would mean that shorter members of the population would not reproduce and would not pass on their genes. So you would see over time the shorter genes, or the genes that would favor shortness in an individual, disappearing from a population. This shifts the graph of the phenotype over towards one extreme or another. So whereas you had an initial average trait, after directional selection takes place, you have a new average trait. In our example that we've been speaking of, the new average would be taller individuals. This tends to affect the extremes of the population more than the average. Disruptive selection tends to be that which can end up causing speciation, or new species to arise. This type of selection favors the extremes of a phenotype and tends to negatively select for the average phenotype or the average trait. So in our example that we've been using of human height, what would happen is the very short individuals and the very tall individuals would have reproductive success, would have offspring, and pass on their genes, while those individuals of average height would not be able to reproduce, would not pass on their genes, and eventually you would see that their genes disappear from the population. Now, if you started to have only short individuals reproducing with short individuals and tall individuals only reproducing with tall individuals, and you have a reproductive isolation, meaning you don't have these two groups of individuals interbreeding, then over time, with many more adaptations, accumulations of mutations, you can have two different species develop. This creates what we call a bimodal distribution. As you see in the graph, after evolution has taken place or after the selection has taken place, you have two peaks in the graph rather than one. Are several examples of natural selection taking place. In this example seen here, you have a population of moths with a distribution of different colors from light to very dark. As time passes, the medium colored butterflies or insects are a disadvantage in the population, so they will die off without reproducing. Eventually, you'll see only light colored and dark colored moths and none of the intermediate individuals. Now we see examples of each of the different types of natural selection taking place. In example number 1, you see lizards of various length, and the average length lizard is the one that is favored in this environment. It is the one that survives and reproduces. In example number 2, you see disruptive selection, where the intermediate trait or this intermediate medium color of shell becomes a disadvantage in this environment. The individuals who have that trait don't reproduce. And in example number 3, you see, yes, I know they look misshapen, but those are elephants. And you see that longer trunk size is an advantage. So those individuals with longer trunks will survive and reproduce. After many generations of natural selection, what you see happening is you see evolution taking place. Evolution is the accumulation of these gradual changes in a species that's due mostly to natural selection. The origin of any species on the planet is speciation. So when speciation occurs, you have a new species evolve. By the way, the definition of a species is it is a group of individuals who are able to produce fertile offspring. Fertile offspring are offspring who are able to then go on and reproduce their own children. So examples of organisms that are not part of the same species would be horses and donkeys. Horses and donkeys, when they have an offspring, make a mule. A mule is not capable of having offspring with horses, with donkeys, or with other mules. They are what we call sterile. Because of that, we know that horses and donkeys are different species. Now, you can't always perform that test with individuals. For example, bacteria don't reproduce sexually, so you can't see that sort of distinction between species. In that case, we tend to look at genetic differences to determine whether organisms are part of the same species. In order to visualize the evolutionary relationships between organisms, those who are studying the evolution of species will often draw what's called a phylogenetic tree. You can think of it as a family tree of species. So the example that we see here shows all living organisms, or the major groups of all living organisms. You'll see at the very bottom where this kind of looks like the trunk of the tree. That would be the original species that first existed. Then you saw that the first species to branch off were the major group bacteria. Those include those various green sulfur, cyanobacteria, proteobacteria, etc. And then you'll see that more closely related are a group of bacteria called archaea, and then a group of organisms called eukarya. Eukarya contains all the multicellular organisms, plants, animals, all the various fungi. So there's the grouping that we belong to. The other two major distinctions are just unicellular bacteria. But you can see how closely all of these are related. Don't worry, for the AP test, you don't need to know all of these terms, but you do need to be able to look at a phylogenetic tree and determine how closely related two species are. To give you an example of how to interpret a phylogenetic tree, if we look at this diagram, you'll see the green sulfur bacteria are mostly more closely related to, say, the flavobacteria than they are to animals or plants. And if you look, you'll see that animals, plants, and fungi show a closer relationship because they branch off at around the same time to each other than we do to ciliates or slime molds. Next, we're going to look at speciation and several different types of evolution that you are required to know for the AP test. Our first example of a type of evolution or speciation is that of adaptive radiation. What you see on the image is the most common example that's associated with adaptive radiation, that of what we call Darwin's finches or Galapagos finches. This is what Charles Darwin, the person who first summarized the theory of evolution, was studying when he came up with the ideas of natural selection. What happens in adaptive radiation is you'll have an organism enter an environment where there are lots of empty niches, and the offspring of that organism will very rapidly adapt to these empty niches, and so you'll see this rapid evolutionary development of multiple species from one ancestor. So if you look in the diagram, you'll see an ancestral seed-eating ground finch that was blown off to the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America. Now, there were no species of bird at the time, so there were lots of empty niches. So you had a variety of the finches adapt to eat mainly insects, some adapt to eat mainly seeds, others adapt to eat cactus seeds and parts of cacti, and others adapt to eat buds and fruits. And as you see, you'll see their beaks show different modifications to allow them to eat their different types of food. And each of these finches became a different species. Divergent evolution is what ultimately drives speciation. So as organisms move into different environments or adapt to different niches, they'll build up mutations, differences from each other over time. And as those mutations build up, as those mutations accumulate, they'll become different enough that they're not able to interbreed anymore. You can often see the evidence of divergent evolution in, for example, the diagram that we have up here, which shows the limbs or the arms or the top limbs, whatever you want to call them, of several different species of vertebrates. You have a monkey, you have a whale, and you have a pig. All of those are examples of mammals. And then you see that of the bird. You can see evidence of the common ancestry of all of these species if you look at the arrangement of the bones. The similar colored bones are the ones that came from the same part of a common ancestor. So you'll notice we all share certain characteristics, but then if you look at the bones of the monkey, the whale, and the pig, they'll show even more similarities to each other than they do to the bird, because the monkey, the whale, and the pig are all mammals and are more closely related to each other than any of them are to birds. You can see from this diagram there are several different types of speciation. However, I don't think that you're going to be responsible for knowing all of these types of speciation on the AP test. I just wanted you to see these examples so you can see that in some cases, for example, in allopatric speciation, what you see is there is some sort of barrier that isolates two populations. In the other examples, peripatric and parapatric, you'll see organisms moving into a new niche, and in sympatric speciation, you'll see that there's some genetic difference that will cause a population to become isolated within the original population and not able to interbreed with the others. I mentioned reproductive isolation several times, so it's about time I gave y'all a definition for it. Reproductive isolation is when organisms, groups of organisms, populations, however you want to name them, can no longer interbreed, and this can be due to multiple things. It can be due to what we call geographic isolation, where they're physically separated from each other. It could be due to genetic incompatibility, meaning that there could be anything from a different number of chromosomes in each organism, or just they can't genetically mix. You could have physical reproductive isolation in that the reproductive organisms of the two species don't work, uh, don't match up, or you can have behavioral differences. So there are some species of birds and other organisms that would be able to physically interbreed if it weren't for the fact that they either reproduce at different times or that they have different courtship rituals. If you remember when we talked about convergent and divergent boundaries, when we talked about the different types of plate tectonic boundaries, you'll remember hopefully that divergent and convergent are opposite of each other. So we've already looked at divergent evolution, where you start out with the same species and it generally gives rise to multiple species. Now we're going to look at a different example. You have multiple species, they have different origins, evolutionarily speaking. They are not closely related to each other, but they'll acquire similar traits to fit into similar niches. The best example of this is the development of wings. So the development of wings has happened several times in evolution, and each time it's happened separately. So the first time that wings developed or evolved were in insects. The next time that wings evolved were in birds. Actually, you could say reptiles like pterodactyls, but birds are related to reptiles anyway, or descended from reptiles. So you have the evolution of flight there, though birds were different in that they evolved feathers. And then the last time you had evolution of wings was in bats, that is mammals. Notice the shapes of the wings are similar because they perform a similar function. That doesn't mean, however, that you have multiple species evolving to become the same species. They are still separate species. They are still not capable of reproducing. You cannot have a fly reproduce with a bird, etc. But they evolve similar traits, like wings. Evolutionary relay is like convergent evolution in that you have species with different evolutionary origins acquiring similar traits because they are occupying similar niches, but this doesn't happen at the same exact time. In the previous example of convergent evolution, we still have not wings, we still have insects, we still have birds, we still have bats, all living at the same time, all with that same adaptation of wings. However, the example of evolutionary relay that we're going to look at is the development of dorsal fins. Dorsal fins help organisms swim through water. They evolved first in sharks, which are very old as a species, and then they evolved separately later on in dinosaurs, particularly the ichthyosaur, which was a swimming dinosaur. Parallel evolution is another of those very related terms where you have multiple species evolving at the same time in similar ecosystems and they acquire similar characteristics. So it's very closely related to convergent evolution. The biggest examples I'm going to show you are that of marsupial and placental mammals, which I'll explain on the next slide, although you do see parallel evolution in plants, which will evolve similar leaf patterns depending on the ecosystems that they're inhabiting. See on this slide are examples of marsupial mammals and placental mammals. Both types of mammals produce live young, they produce milk, they have hair, but they're different in that placental mammals will develop, they have a placenta nourishing them when they're in the uterus. Marsupial mammals, on the other hand, are born what we might consider prematurely, and then they'll nurse for the first couple of months of their life in a pouch. So, for example, kangaroos, koalas, those are examples of marsupials. Most of the surviving species of marsupials are found in and around Australia, but you'll notice that in these pictures, you'll see a marsupial mammal, next to it a placental mammal that has very similar characteristics. The first two that you see on the left, you'll see two flying rodents, the flying squirrel being the one amongst the placental mammals. Underneath that, you see a Tasmanian wolf, which are now extinct, and you'll see a placental wolf, which are the kinds of wolves we find in North America. Yes, that is Team Jacob's wolf. But you'll notice that these different organisms, even though they evolved in separate places, they evolved similar characteristics, similar traits. They even look similar to each other because they're adapting to similar environments. We've talked about different methods of evolution. Now we're going to talk about the timing of evolution. Evolution can happen at two different rates, either very slowly in incremental changes that happen over a long period of time. That is known as gradualism, or evolution can happen very quickly. It can happen suddenly. And when I mean suddenly, I don't mean in the course of 5 minutes, of course. I mean over the course of maybe a couple of generations. This is punctuated equilibrium. Hopefully you learned about both of these terms when you took biology, but if it's been a while, this should be a good refresher for you. Both gradualism and punctuated equilibrium happen during the history of a species, but it depends on how the environmental conditions are changing. If the environmental conditions are changing very gradually and slowly, then the species will likely evolve gradually and slowly. On the other hand, if the environment is changing rapidly in small, very rapid changes, then evolution will likely happen via punctuated equilibrium. These are two phylogenetic trees designed to show you the difference between evolution as it would happen in gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. So gradual evolution is the top phylogenetic tree that you see, and you'll see that instead of having very sharp disconnects or sharp areas of speciation, species will gradually become different from each other. Morphology means the physical structure of the organism, and as the morphology gets further away, almost in what would be the x-axis on this graph, if it were that kind of graph, as it gets farther away, it's going to be an organism looking different than either its ancestors or other species. If you'll notice in punctuated equilibrium, everything's very sharp, everything's very, well, punctuated. You'll see species evolve very suddenly, and when they evolve, they will be noticeably different from related organisms, and those differences will happen very quickly, very suddenly. Genetic drift is not actually an instance of evolution. Genetic drift, however, can influence evolution. Genetic drift is randomness, it's chance. It's not that an organism that died was poorly suited to its environment. It's not that a gene spreads because it is well suited or well adapted to an environment. Something random happened. So the example that you see here, you see a number of beetles. If a person walks along and squishes most of the green members of the beetle population, then what you'll see in the resulting population is mostly tan beetles, very few beetles. And it's not that the green beetle wasn't well adapted, it was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So chance can also play a hand in evolution of species as well. If you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, it doesn't matter whether you're well adapted to your environment. Let's say you get taken out by a flood, you get taken out in a forest fire, you're still not going to pass on your genes. Population bottlenecks are also not necessarily related to the fitness of individuals. What happens is, just like the bottleneck of a bottle reduces the flow of liquid coming through it, a population bottleneck or a bottleneck event is when something that happens that kills off a lot of the species. What will happen is your population size is dramatically reduced for at least one generation, and you can lose a lot of your genetic diversity at this time. In fact, a lot of the organisms that are now endangered have undergone some sort of bottleneck effect. A lot of times that's due to humans influencing their population, killing them, destroying their habitat, etc. But the risk becomes when you have such a bottleneck event and such low genetic diversity, a smaller gene pool, you have less differences between individuals to allow the chance for populations to adapt to any changing conditions. This increases the chance that you're going to have some sort of extinction happen to that species. And speaking of different timescales of evolution, you can have evolution happening in a very short term, changes that you can see from over a couple of generations, or you can have evolution that takes place over a very long period of time. Microevolution is evolution that's going to take place over a very short period of time. These are some of the generation to generation differences that you can see in a population. A famous example of microevolution is that of the peppered moths in England. Hopefully you heard about this in biology class. There were moths in England that had two different colors, very light and very dark. Originally, the moths that were most common in the population were the light moths because they camouflaged well against trees. But after the Industrial Revolution, when there was a bunch of soot darkening the trees, the darker moths now had the advantage, and they became the most common members of the population. That was an example of microevolution. Macroevolution, on the other hand, tends to include the types of very large-scale changes of a species that we tend to think of when we think of evolution. This involves extinction, this involves speciation. So the example that you see here are relatives that are now extinct of today's modern elephants, the woolly mammals, and you'll notice the adaptations they had to their very cold environment. They were, as their name implies, very woolly. At the bottom, you see African elephants. Notice they don't have a lot of hair. They live in a much warmer environment, so there are dramatic differences between those two species as they've adapted to their different environments. Inevitably, when we get to talk of evolution, we get to start talking about, well, where did the first life come from in the first place? How did something as complex as life evolve from non-living elements? There are multiple theories. The one that I'm really going to focus on is kind of the primeval soup hypothesis, which states that life first evolved in the oceans, and the way the organic compounds or the biomolecules that make up living things first developed was that you had these building blocks, various elements of the atmosphere and various elements that were dissolved in the ocean would combine using energy from lightning or energy from other sources, and as gradually they formed more complex molecules, those molecules eventually came together once enough of them had developed to create the first protocells or the first life on the planet. There have been experiments that have tried to mimic what these original conditions, atmospheric conditions, were supposed to have been like at the time life evolved, and they have managed to produce most of the amino acids that exist in living things today, as well as the nitrogen bases from DNA and RNA. In case you were wondering what those components of the early atmosphere were, here is a graph that is showing you the concentration of these various gases over the past 4+ billion years. So initially, water made up a larger percentage of the atmosphere, almost 25% of the atmosphere, than it does today. You saw that you can see on here at the top that methane and ammonia also made up a significant component of the atmosphere. Nitrogen has made up the majority of the atmosphere for the entirety of the existence of the planet. You'll see that carbon dioxide also used to make up a larger percentage of the atmosphere for a time. And it's only within the past 2.5 billion years or so that oxygen has become a major component in the atmosphere. And keep that in mind because we're going to talk about that in a few slides. So the diagram that you see here shows a very famous experiment by two scientists, Miller and Urey. One of them was the grad student of the other. And they built this apparatus to try to simulate conditions on the early planet. So you'll notice that at the bottom right, they have a flask of boiling water that produces water vapor. Then they added into the mix hydrogen, methane, and ammonia gases that were supposed to be in relatively high concentration in the early atmosphere. Those then traveled in this apparatus to where you see that spark, and that is an electrode that's producing electricity that's supposed to mimic lightning in the early atmosphere. And then finally you have a condenser that cools this down into a liquid. Notice you've basically got the water cycle going here. Now, at that condenser, they would take out some of the solution that was produced and they would test it for these various organic molecules, such as amino acids or parts of nucleic acids like DNA. And as they ran this, they let this run for a while, and as they ran this, they started getting more and more complex molecules formed. This experiment formed the basis for many others that try to simulate the conditions that could have first produced life. And while they have not made completely artificial life forms yet, some scientists are getting, in my opinion, disturbingly close. As long as we're talking about evolution and extinction, one thing that we should talk about are mass extinction events. What you see up here shows the timeline of evolution over the entirety of the period of time where life has existed on the planet. What you'll see is there were a succession of different organisms that existed at any given time. You'll notice for example, Jurassic periods, Triassic periods, etc., those epochs and eras and periods and so on that we studied at the very beginning of the year when we talked about the geologic time scale. That's the scale on which evolution is measured, millions and billions of years. Now, it all was not sun and sunshine and daisies and flowers and such. You had many cases, many periods of time where a large number of organisms went extinct. There are 5 major periods of time in evolutionary history where in the fossil record you see a lot of organisms suddenly disappear. A lot of different species suddenly disappear. These are called mass extinction events, and they were caused by various factors. Some, such as the first mass extinction event, was caused when organisms first started performing photosynthesis and produced oxygen as a waste product. Oxygen is very toxic to a lot of species, to anaerobic species that live without oxygen present, obviously, because it would kill them. And so once oxygen started being produced in large quantities, it actually killed off a vast majority of the bacteria that were living on the planet at the time. Then you have one of the most recent mass extinction events, which is the extinction of the dinosaurs about 65 million years ago, and that was caused most probably by a large meteor hitting the Earth's surface and causing global changes in climate. Speaking of global changes in climate, a lot of scientists, a lot of ecologists believe that we're now in the 6th major extinction event, and that it is caused entirely by humans, and it is happening right now. And some think that it could be the most catastrophic yet. I'm trying to freak you out. The shining light in all of this is that after a mass extinction, there's usually some adaptive radiation, rapid speciation taking place that fills all these vacant niches. In fact, the species that we have now, our species may not exist were it not for the last mass extinction event, because after the extinction of the dinosaurs, you had the age of mammals, where a lot of mammals rapidly evolved to fill up the vacant niches that you had. Alas, this is from a Discovery Channel webpage that no longer exists. It was pretty neat. You could look at each of the 5 or 6 major extinction events that have happened throughout the course of history, and see the major causes, see the organisms that died off during that period of time. Alas, it does not work, but I'll see if we can find some videos to watch in class. I hope this has been helpful to y'all. If it has, feel free to leave some comments or let me know in class whether you find this useful. My apologies for all of the mistakes, stuttering, etc. I don't exactly have a script written. I just kind of talked through this like I would through teaching in class. Goodbye. Have a lovely day. See y'all in class.